They mocked her tiny inheritance until she opened the hidden compartment in the workshop. If you've ever felt counted out or underestimated, this story is for you. Hit that subscribe button because we're building a community here for people who know what it's like to fight back. The air in Mr. Davies' office always smelled the same: weak coffee, disinfectant, and the faint, papery scent of fading hope. It was the smell of the system. For 6 years, it had been the smell of my life. On my 18th birthday, the day I was supposed to be free, the smell was thicker than ever, clinging to the back of my throat. Mr. Davies slid a thin manila envelope across the polished surface of his desk. It made a dry, scraping sound, the only sound in the room besides the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. "That's it, Elara," he said, his voice a practiced, neutral monotone. He'd used the same tone to tell me my foster placement had been changed, to inform me I'd missed too many school days, to remind me that my grandfather was gone and not coming back. "Happy birthday." The words were absurd. Happy birthday. A birthday in this place was just a date on a form, a box ticked. It meant you were 1 year closer to being someone else's problem, until you weren't a problem at all, just a line item signed off and released. Today, I was released. I picked up the envelope. It was disappointingly light. Inside was a cashier's check for $500, a single, old-fashioned iron key, and a letter from a law firm I'd never heard of. The letter was clipped to a formal document stating that, as the sole heir of Silas Blackwood, I was now the legal owner of a property located at 14 Sparrow Lane, Blackwood Creek. $500 and a key to a place I barely remembered. This was it. This was the sum total of my inheritance, the legacy of the man who had taught me how to identify constellations and how to hold a hammer. The man whose sudden death had thrown my 10-year-old life into the sterile, unforgiving arms of the state. A bitter laugh threatened to bubble up, but I swallowed it down. In places like this, you learn to swallow everything: your anger, your grief, your questions. You learn that making noise only brings you the wrong kind of attention. "The property. It's his old workshop, I believe," Mr. Davies added, already tidying his desk, his body language signaling the end of our final interview. The estate was modest. This is the final settlement. Modest. That was a social worker's word for nothing. I looked at the check. $500. It was enough for a bus ticket and maybe a week in a cheap motel. It was severance pay, not a start to a new life. It was an insult wrapped in legal paper. I saw a flicker of something in Mr. Davies' eyes, not pity exactly, but a kind of weary resignation. He'd seen this scene play out 100 times, the hopeful, terrified kid aging out with nothing but a garbage bag of belongings and a handful of cash that would disappear faster than smoke. "Thank you," I said, the words tasting like ash. "It was what you were supposed to say. Be grateful. Be polite. Don't cause a scene." He nodded, not quite meeting my eyes. "The bus station is 3 blocks east. Good luck, Elara. Good luck." He might as well have said, "Don't come back." I stood up, my own garbage bag of clothes and books clutched in one hand, the pathetic envelope in the other. The room felt small, suffocating. My entire childhood, or what was left of it, was being concluded in this 10 by 10 box that smelled of bleach. I walked to the door, my footsteps silent on the linoleum floor. I didn't look back. I knew what I would see. Mr. Davies, already picking up the phone, already moving on to the next case file, the next tragedy in the making. The door clicked shut behind me, the sound echoing down the long, empty hallway, the sound of an ending, the sound of being utterly and completely on my own. For a long moment, I just stood there, in the quiet hall, the key in my palm feeling both impossibly heavy and terrifyingly small. The cold iron felt like a final goodbye. The bus station was a purgatory of flickering screens and the smell of greasy food. I sat in a hard plastic chair, the manila envelope on my lap, the world outside the grimy windows a blur of indifferent motion. I had 2 hours until the next bus heading north, towards a place that was only a ghost in my memory, Blackwood Creek. I hadn't been there since the funeral. I was 10, and the entire day was a smear of black clothes, hushed whispers, and the confusing, hollow ache of a world that had suddenly tilted on its axis. I pulled out the contents of the envelope again, laying them carefully on the seat beside me. The check for $500. It seemed even smaller under the harsh fluorescent lights of the terminal. In the group home, there was a girl, Maya, who got a trust fund when she turned 18. She'd talked about it for months, planning her escape to a life of college and travel. Another boy, Kevin, had an aunt who took him in, giving him a room and a job at her diner. They had safety nets. I had this. A check that wouldn't cover first and last month's rent on a broom closet in the city. It was a joke. A cruel, final punchline to a story I didn't understand. The key was heavy, made of dark, pitted iron. It looked ancient, like it belonged to a castle dungeon, not a workshop. The head was a simple, unadorned loop, the shaft thick, the bit a complex series of rectangular teeth. It felt nothing like the flimsy, modern keys on the ring Mr. Davies had just taken back from me. This key had history. It had weight. I traced the cold metal with my thumb, trying to recall the door it might open. I had a vague image of a wide, sliding barn door, painted a faded red. Of my grandfather, Silas, his hands covered in sawdust, smiling as he unlocked it. Then there was the letter from the lawyer. I read it again. Dear Ms. Blackwood, please be advised that the estate of Mr. Silas Blackwood has been settled. As per the terms of his will, all remaining assets are to be transferred to you upon your 18th birthday. These assets consist of the property and structure located at 14 Sparrow Lane, Blackwood Creek, and the enclosed settlement funds. We wish you the best in your future endeavors. Remaining assets. Settlement funds. The language was so sterile, so detached. It was designed to create distance, to turn a life's work into a transaction. My grandfather had been a master carpenter, a craftsman. His hands were clever and kind. He could turn a block of plain pine into a soaring bird, a gnarled piece of oak into a smooth, polished box that felt like silk. His workshop wasn't just a structure, it was his sanctuary. It was the place he'd taught me the names of different woods by their scent alone, the sharp spice of cedar, the sweet perfume of cherry, the earthy smell of walnut. How could that man, the man who had patiently sanded the sharp corners off a small wooden stool he'd built just for me, leave me with almost nothing? The question had been a dull ache in my chest for years, a quiet, persistent hum of betrayal beneath the louder noise of my grief. In the group home, you tell yourself stories to survive. My story was that he would have provided for me if he could have, that there was a reason. But the $500 check felt like a definitive, brutal answer. The reason was that there was nothing left. He had died, and his world had died with him, leaving me with only the scraps. I folded the letter and put it away. The hurt was a familiar stone in my gut. I was used to disappointment. The system teaches you that. It teaches you not to expect anything, not to hope too hard. Because hope is a vulnerability. Hope can be weaponized against you. But as I sat there, the iron key clutched in my hand, a different feeling began to surface, something stubborn and small. It wasn't hope. It was curiosity. This key, this property, it was the only thing I had left of him. It was the only tangible link to a life before the system, before the files and the caseworkers and the endless succession of temporary beds. Selling it for whatever few dollars it was worth felt like selling my own memory. Maybe, just maybe, going there wasn't about the inheritance. Maybe it was about finding an answer, not about the money, but about the man. I bought a one-way ticket to a town I could barely picture. A town named after my own family, a place where I had nothing and no one. It was the only place I had left to go. The bus ride was a long, slow crawl away from the city's concrete maze and into the sprawling, unkempt heart of the country. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the window, watching the landscape bleed from gray to green. Skyscrapers gave way to suburban sprawl, then to flat, open farmland dotted with lonely silos. The sky was a vast, indifferent sheet of white. Rain began to fall, not a storm, but a persistent, weeping drizzle that slicked the roads and blurred the world outside into a watercolor painting of greens and browns. Each drop that traced a path down the window felt like a tick of a clock, moving me further from the only life I knew and closer to an absolute unknown. My reflection in the glass was a pale, ghostly, superimposed image over the passing fields. A girl with tired eyes and a tense set to her jaw. A girl who looked like she was bracing for a blow. I was. For 6 years, I'd been bracing. You learn to walk through the world as if it's a minefield, stepping lightly, making yourself small, trying not to set anything off. You learn that stability is an illusion. A foster family could be kind, and then a call would come in the middle of the night, and by morning you'd be in a different house, with different rules, a different set of strangers to navigate. The only constant was the feeling of being a guest, a temporary resident in someone else's life. My grandfather's house had never felt like that. With him, I had belonged. My memories of him were sensory, fragmented but potent. The smell of sawdust in his hair, the rough, calloused feel of his hand holding mine, the low rumble of his voice as he read to me from worn-out adventure books before bed. After his accident, a fall at a construction site, they'd said, those memories became dangerous. In the early days of being in care, I would cling to them so tightly it felt like I was suffocating. The social workers called it unhealthy attachment to the past. They encouraged me to move forward, to focus on my new reality. So I learned to pack the memories away, to bury them deep where they couldn't be touched or analyzed or judged. But now, on this bus, they were rising to the surface, unbidden. I remembered the workshop. It was set back from his small house, a large, barn-like building that was his kingdom. To me, it was a magical place, filled with strange machines that whirred and screamed, and stacks of wood that held the promise of 1,000 different creations. He let me have my own little corner, with a small workbench and a set of my own tools, a small hammer, a screwdriver, a sanding block. He taught me to respect the tools, to clean them, to put them back where they belonged. A place for everything, and everything in its place, he'd say, tapping the side of his nose. That's the secret, Alara. Not just for the shop, but for everything. What happened to that order? What happened to his world where everything had a place? The $500 check didn't fit. It felt like a piece from a different puzzle, a wrong note in a familiar song. Had he been in debt? Had his business failed? I had been too young to understand the finances of it all, and in the years since, no one had ever offered any details. There was just the accident, the funeral, and then the sterile office where a woman with kind eyes and a sad smile told me I would have to go live somewhere else for a while. A while had turned into the rest of my childhood. The bus rumbled on, the rhythmic thump of the tires on the wet pavement a monotonous drumbeat. I thought about the other kids at the home. Most of them were angry. They raged at the world, at their parents, at the system. I had never been angry like that. My feelings were colder, quieter, a deep, abiding disappointment, a feeling of being left behind. Now, for the first time, a flicker of anger sparked within that coldness. It wasn't directed at the system, not this time. It was for him, for Silas. How could you build a world for me and then leave me with nothing to hold on to but the key to its empty shell? The question echoed in the hollow space inside my chest, unanswered, as the bus drove deeper and deeper into the rain-soaked countryside, toward a place that held either the last remnants of a broken promise or a truth I wasn't yet prepared to face. The bus pulled into Blackwood Creek just as the sun was beginning to set, painting the bruised-looking clouds in shades of orange and purple. The bus stop wasn't a station, just a covered bench in front of a closed-down general store with soaped-up windows. I was the only one who got off. The bus hissed and pulled away, its red taillights shrinking into the twilight, leaving me in a profound and sudden silence. The air was cool and damp, thick with the smell of wet earth and pine needles. The town was smaller and sadder than I remembered. The main street consisted of a handful of storefronts, a few with lights on, a tavern, a small grocery, but most were dark. Paint was peeling on every building, and a sense of weary neglect hung over the entire place. It felt like a town that time had forgotten, or perhaps had actively decided to pass by. My grandfather's family had helped found this place, or so he'd told me. Now, it seemed to be slowly returning to the forest that pressed in on all sides. Sparrow Lane was at the far end of town, barely more than a gravel track that branched off the main road. I walked, my garbage bag slung over my shoulder, the sound of my footsteps crunching loud in the quiet air. And then I saw it. The workshop. It was set about 50 yards back from the lane, partially obscured by overgrown lilac bushes. The red paint I vaguely remembered was now a patchwork of faded crimson and weathered gray wood. The roof sagged in the middle, and one of the windows was boarded up. It looked abandoned, derelict. A wave of despair washed over me. This was it. This was my inheritance, a collapsing shack. My heart pounded as I approached. The big sliding door I remembered was shut fast. Beside it was a smaller, normal-sized door. The lock was an old, heavy iron plate, rusted around the edges. I pulled the key from my pocket. My hand was trembling slightly as I slid it into the keyhole. It was stiff, and I had to jiggle it, putting my shoulder into the door. For a second, I was sure it wouldn't work, that this was the final, pathetic failure. Then, with a deep, groaning clunk, the lock turned. The door swung inward on protesting hinges, opening into a wall of darkness. The smell hit me first. It was the scent I remembered, but layered with years of neglect. The sharp, clean fragrance of wood and oil was still there, but underneath it was the damp, musty odor of dust, decay, and time. I fumbled along the wall inside the door, my fingers searching for a light switch. I found it, and with a flick, a single, bare bulb suspended from the high ceiling sputtered to life, casting a weak, yellow glow over the cavernous space. It was like stepping into a photograph from another lifetime. Everything was covered in a thick, uniform blanket of gray dust. Cobwebs, thick as cotton, draped from the rafters and clung to the tools hanging on the walls. His tools. Saws of every size, hammers, chisels, planes, all arranged in neat rows on pegboards, their outlines softened by the dust. Stacks of lumber leaned against one wall, warped and gray. In the center of the room stood the main workbench, a massive thing made of heavy oak, its surface scarred with the marks of 1,000 projects. A half-finished rocking horse sat on it, one of its rockers only partially carved, the chisel lying beside it as if my grandfather had just set it down to take a break. He hadn't. He had set it down and never come back. A lump formed in my throat. I walked deeper into the room, my boots leaving clean prints in the dust. I ran a hand over the workbench, the fine powder soft as velvet under my fingers. This was his space. It was so completely him, so full of his presence, that it felt like he was standing right behind me. I saw my own small corner, the little workbench he'd built for me still there, a tiny, dust-covered hammer resting on its surface. I picked it up. It felt impossibly small in my adult hand. Overwhelmed, I sank onto a dusty stool. What was I supposed to do with this? This museum of a dead man's life? Mr. Davies' word came back to me. Modest. He was wrong. This wasn't modest. This was heartbreaking. I spent the next hour just walking, touching things, the dust stirring in the still air and dancing in the weak light. The place needed to be condemned, probably. But as I moved through the quiet chaos, a strange feeling took root. This wasn't just a building, it was an archive, a story, and I was standing in the middle of it. As I was sweeping a clear patch on the floor near the main workbench, just to have a place to put my bag down, my foot snagged on a floorboard. It wasn't a snag, the board shifted, lifting slightly at one end. I stopped, my heart giving a sudden, sharp thump. I knelt down, my fingers tracing the edge. It was cut differently from the others, a perfect rectangle. Using the claw of my own small hammer, I wedged it into the seam and pried. The board came up with a soft groan of old nails, and there, nestled in the dark space below, was a small, dark green metal box. It wasn't covered in dust, it was clean. It had been placed there deliberately, and not long before the end. The metal box was cold and heavy in my hands. It wasn't locked with a keyhole, just a simple, sturdy latch on the front. My fingers were clumsy as I worked it open. I was half expecting, half hoping for money. A secret stash that would explain the insulting check. But the box wasn't full of cash. It was full of paper, a thick stack of envelopes, bound together with a piece of ordinary twine. My grandfather's handwriting was on the top one. For Ilara. My breath caught. I sat down on the dusty floor, the single bare bulb overhead making my shadow long and distorted. I untied the twine, my heart hammering against my ribs. The letters were dated, starting about 2 months before his death, and ending just 2 days before the accident. This was a journal, a final testament he'd hidden away. I pulled the first letter from its envelope. The paper was crisp, the ink a strong, dark blue. "My dearest Ilara," it began, "if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and the world has failed you in the way I feared most. It also means you were smart enough and stubborn enough to come back here. I knew you would be. You have my hands, but you have your grandmother's spirit. That spirit is the most valuable thing you will ever own." I had to stop and take a breath, my eyes blurring. His voice was so clear in the written words, it was as if he were whispering them in my ear. I continued reading. "I imagine you are confused and hurt. I imagine you feel that I abandoned you. The pittance the lawyers will have given you was designed to make you feel that way. It was designed to make everyone believe that I died a broken, penniless man. It was a lie, Ilara. One of the hardest lies I have ever had to tell. It was a lie to protect you." The letter went on to explain everything. He hadn't been a failing craftsman. His business had been thriving. He'd taken on a partner to handle the business side of things, allowing him to focus on the woodwork he loved. But the partner, a man named Marcus Thorne, had been a wolf. He'd been secretly cooking the books, taking out massive, predatory loans against the business in my grandfather's name, from a ruthless corporation called Northwood Development. Thorne had been funneling the money away, leaving Silas with an insurmountable, fraudulent debt. "By the time I discovered the betrayal," he wrote, "it was too late. Thorne had vanished, and Northwood came for me. They didn't want the money, not really. They want the land. This land. All of it, all through the valley. They have been buying up this town piece by piece, strangling it, waiting to redevelop it into some rich man's resort. My workshop, our home, was one of the last holdouts. The debt Thorne left me with was their leverage. They were going to take everything." He explained that he'd spent his last months in a desperate, secret battle. He couldn't declare bankruptcy. They had structured the debt in such a way that it would attach to him personally, and therefore to his estate, to his only heir, to me. If he died with any visible assets, they would have a legal claim on me. They would hound me for a debt I didn't owe, for the rest of my life. "So I had to create an illusion," the letter continued. "I sold off equipment I didn't need. I let the house fall into disrepair. I told everyone who would listen that business was bad, that I was ruined. I made myself look worthless, so that when I was gone, the property you inherited would also look worthless. The $500 was the final touch on that lie. Enough to be a legal settlement, but not enough to attract any attention. It was the price of your freedom, little bird. It was all I could do to make sure their greed died with me and didn't follow you. Tears were streaming down my face now, dripping onto the dusty floorboards, making small, dark circles in the gray powder. He hadn't abandoned me. He had built me a fortress out of a lie. He had sacrificed his name, his legacy, everything, just to keep me safe. This workshop is your real inheritance, the final paragraph read. They think it's a ruin. They don't know its secrets. I have left you a choice, Ilera. The easy path is to sell this land for the pittance they will surely offer you and disappear. I would not blame you if you did. The harder path is to stay, to fight, to reclaim what is ours. The answer to how is in this shop. You just have to look. You were always good at finding things. Look where the light never touches. I love you more than all the stars I taught you. Be brave. Your loving grandpa, Silas. I finished the first letter, and then the second, and the third. Each one filled in more details, painting a picture of a man under siege, fighting a silent, desperate war against an invisible enemy. He wrote about his fear for me, his regret for trusting the wrong person, and his unwavering belief in my strength. He wasn't just a carpenter, he was a warrior, and his final act was to forge a shield for me out of his own ruin. When I finally looked up from the last page, the single yellow bulb seemed dimmer, the shadows in the corners of the workshop deeper. The grief I felt was immense, a physical weight in my chest. I cried for the man I had lost, for the years he had suffered alone. I cried for the 10-year-old girl who had felt so utterly abandoned, who had spent 6 years believing a lie that was designed to save her. I wept until my throat was raw and my eyes were swollen shut. Then, slowly, another feeling began to burn through the sorrow. It was a cold, hard anger. An anger directed at Marcus Thorne, the man who had betrayed him. An anger at Northwood Development, the faceless corporation that had squeezed the life out of this town and the man I loved. They had counted on me being a scared, broken kid who would take their chump change and run. They had underestimated my grandfather, and now they were underestimating me. I looked around the dusty, silent workshop. It wasn't a ruin anymore. It was a battleground. It was a promise. The choice he had left me wasn't a choice at all. How could I walk away from this? From him? Selling this place would be like spitting on his grave. It would be letting them win. Have you ever had a moment where the entire story of your life was turned upside down? Where you learned that what you thought was abandonment was actually the most profound act of protection? It shatters you. It takes every certainty you had and turns it to dust. But then, in the rubble, it gives you something new. It gives you a choice. Not just about what to do next, but about who you are going to be. Let me know in the comments if you've ever had to face a choice like that, a moment that redefined everything. Because what I did next, it wasn't the easy path, but it was the only one I could take. I stood up, wiped the tears and dust from my face, and for the first time in 6 years, I felt like I was home. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I sat on the floor of the workshop, leaning against the leg of the massive workbench, the stack of my grandfather's letters in my lap. I read them over and over, absorbing his words, his voice, his desperate, loving strategy. The grief was still there, a deep, resonant ache, but now it was intertwined with a fierce, burning purpose. The sun rose, sending pale fingers of light through the grimy windows, illuminating the swirling dust motes in the air like tiny, golden insects. The light didn't feel like an intrusion. It felt like a call to action. My choice was made. I wasn't going anywhere. This place, this dusty sanctuary of wood and memory, was mine. It had been bought and paid for with my grandfather's sacrifice, and I would not let it go for a handful of silver from the men who had hunted him. My first priority was survival. The $500, which had seemed like an insult just yesterday, now felt like a sacred trust. It was the last piece of his plan, the seed money for my resistance. I walked into the small town of Blackwood Creek, which looked a little less sad in the morning light. The grocery store was open, a bell jingling merrily as I entered. An older woman with kind eyes and flour on her apron looked up from behind the counter. "Well now, haven't seen you around here before," she said, her voice warm. "I'm Alara Blackwood," I said, the name feeling solid and real in my mouth for the first time. Silas was my grandfather. Her expression softened instantly. "Oh, sweet girl, I'm so sorry about Silas. He was a good man. We all miss him." She introduced herself as Mrs. Gable. I bought what I could: bread, cheese, peanut butter, a large container of water, a cheap sleeping bag, and a bundle of cleaning supplies. It made a significant dent in my funds, but it was an investment in my new life. Back at the workshop, the real work began. I wasn't just cleaning, I was reclaiming. I started by opening the large sliding barn door, which took all my strength to budge. It groaned and scraped along its track, but finally rolled open, flooding the space with fresh air and bright, clear daylight. The sun streamed in, cutting through the gloom and revealing the true extent of the neglect. It didn't discourage me, it energized me. I spent the entire day in a frenzy of activity. I swept away years of accumulated dust and wood shavings, the piles growing into small mountains. I wiped down every surface, every tool, my hands growing raw from the work. With each sweep of the broom, with each tool I cleaned and hung back on its pegboard, I felt like I was erasing the lie and restoring the truth. This was not a place of failure. This was a place of creation, of skill, of love. The physical labor was grounding, exhausting. It kept the grief from overwhelming me. It turned my sorrow into sweat. As I worked, I thought about his final clue. Look where the light never touches. I let my eyes roam over the vast space. The workshop was a single large room with a high vaulted ceiling. Windows lined the east and south walls, letting in the morning and afternoon sun. The west wall was mostly taken up by the large sliding door. But the north wall, it was a solid, windowless expanse of rough-hewn timber, stretching from the floor to the rafters. It was the only part of the workshop that was perpetually in shadow. The light never touched it. I finished my initial cleaning for the day as dusk began to settle, my body aching in ways I didn't know it could. I ate my simple meal of bread and cheese, sitting on the now clean steps of the workshop, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. The same constellations he had taught me. I felt a profound sense of peace settle over me. I was broke, alone, and sleeping on the floor of a dilapidated building. But I was no longer adrift. I had a mission. I had a home. That night, zipped into my new sleeping bag on a patch of clean floor, I slept a deep, dreamless sleep for the first time in years. The air didn't smell like disinfectant. It smelled like cedar and dust and promise. The next day, I turned my attention to the north wall. It was constructed of wide, vertical planks of dark wood, weathered and uneven. I started at one end and worked my way across, running my hands over every inch of the surface. I was looking for anything unusual: a seam, a loose board, a hidden latch. The wood was rough under my fingertips, full of splinters and knots. I pushed, pulled, and tapped, listening for a hollow sound. Nothing. It was just a solid wall of old wood. Hours passed. Frustration began to creep in. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe it was a metaphor, not a literal instruction. I was about to give up for the day when my fingers brushed against a knot in the wood, about chest high. It looked like any other knot, a dark swirl in the grain. But as my thumb pressed into it, it felt wrong. It was too smooth, too perfectly round. It didn't have the rough, organic texture of a real knot. My heart started to beat faster. I examined it closely. It looked like it had been carved and then set into the plank, its grain expertly matched. I went to the workbench and found a thin, sharp chisel and a mallet. Taking a deep breath, I placed the edge of the chisel into the faint seam around the knot and gave it a gentle tap. It didn't budge. I tapped it again, harder. A tiny crack appeared. With a mix of excitement and fear, I worked the chisel around the edge, carefully, not wanting to damage the wood. Finally, with a soft pop, the wooden plug came loose. I pulled it out. It was a perfectly turned disc of wood, about 3 inches deep, and behind it, nestled in a small, dark cavity, was not a key or a letter, but a single, folded piece of paper. It was a hand-drawn schematic, rendered in my grandfather's precise, architectural script. It was a diagram of the main workbench. A car door slammed outside, the sound unnervingly loud in the rural quiet. I quickly pushed the wooden plug back into its hole and spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. A sleek, black sedan was parked in the gravel lane, a car that screamed money and city. It didn't belong here. A man in a sharp, tailored suit got out and walked towards the workshop. He moved with an easy, predatory confidence. He was tall, with slicked-back hair and a smile that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Alara Blackwood?" he asked, stopping a few feet from me. His voice was smooth as silk. "Who's asking?" I said, my hand tightening on the chisel I was still holding. His smile widened a fraction. "My name is Jensen. I'm with Northwood Development. I understand you've recently taken possession of this property." Northwood. The name sent a chill down my spine. This was them. This was the enemy. "It's mine," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Indeed," he said, taking a slow look around at the workshop, his gaze dismissive. "And we'd like to make you an offer to take it off your hands. This whole area is scheduled for a significant revitalization project. A luxury resort, golf course, a real asset to the community. Your grandfather, unfortunately, wasn't interested in progress. But we're hoping you're a bit more pragmatic." He pulled a thick envelope from his jacket pocket and held it out. "We're prepared to offer you $10,000. For the land, of course. The structure itself is a liability. We'd be doing you a favor by demolishing it." $10,000. It was a fortune compared to my 500. A year ago, I would have snatched it without a second thought. Now, it was an insult. It was a test. They were testing to see if I was the broken, desperate kid they thought I was. "No thank you," I said. Jensen's smile faltered for the first time. He looked genuinely surprised. "I don't think you understand, Miss Blackwood. This is a very generous, one-time offer. Given the back taxes owed on the property and its general state of decay, it's more than fair. You should think about it. You have 1 week to accept." He dropped the envelope onto the dusty ground between us. It was a power move, an act of contempt. "I don't need a week," I said, my voice ringing with a strength I didn't know I possessed. "The answer is no." He stared at me for a long moment, his eyes narrowing. The mask of civility had slipped, and I could see the cold, ruthless shark underneath. "That would be a mistake," he said softly. Then he turned, walked back to his silent, expensive car, and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust and the thick envelope lying on the ground. The pressure was on. But as I picked up the schematic he had interrupted me from finding, I knew I wasn't just defending a piece of land anymore. I was going on the attack. The schematic was drawn on old, yellowed drafting paper, the kind my grandfather always used. It was a cross-section of the massive oak workbench that dominated the center of the room. The diagram was incredibly detailed, showing every joint, every brace, every drawer. But it also showed something else, something hidden. A complex series of gears and levers concealed within the workbench's thick legs and frame, all connecting to a large, empty space in the center, labeled simply, the heart. On the bottom right corner of the drawing, there was a small, intricate sketch of a key. It was unlike any key I had ever seen, with a complex, star-shaped bit, and next to it, a note. The knot was the first test. This is the second. The key is in the heart of the heartwood. The heart of the heartwood. The phrase echoed in my mind. Heartwood is the dense, central part of a tree trunk, the oldest and strongest wood. My grandfather had loved to talk about it, about how it was the tree's core, its strength. I looked around the workshop, at the stacks of lumber. He had worked with dozens of types of wood. Which one? And what did he mean by its heart? My eyes fell upon the unfinished rocking horse sitting on the workbench. It was carved from a single, massive block of cherry wood. Cherry was one of his favorites. He loved its warm, reddish-brown color and its fine, straight grain. The horse's body was smooth and almost complete, but one of the rockers was only half-formed, the wood still rough and blocky. It was the last thing he had touched, the last thing he had worked on. It felt significant. I ran my hand over the unfinished rocker. It was where he had stopped. I thought about the phrase again. The heart of the heartwood. Not just the heartwood of any tree, but the heart of the piece he was working on. The very center of it. I picked up the half-carved block of wood. It was heavy. I looked at it from all angles. It seemed solid. But then I remembered his other lesson. Listen to the wood, Alara. It will tell you its secrets. I held it up to my ear and tapped it with my knuckle. The sound was a dull thud. I tapped it again, moving along its length. Thud. 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 Then, right in the center, the sound changed. It wasn't a thud, it was a higher-pitched, hollow-sounding talk. My breath hitched. There was a cavity inside. With trembling hands, I carried the block to the workbench vise and secured it. I took a deep breath and picked up the chisel he had left beside it. This felt like a desecration, destroying the last thing he ever made. But the schematic, the threat from Jensen, it all told me this was what I had to do. This was the path he had laid out for me. I placed the chisel on the spot that had sounded hollow and gently tapped it with a mallet. The wood splintered. I tapped again, harder, and a chunk of the cherry wood broke away, revealing a small, precisely drilled hole. And inside, wrapped in a piece of soft velvet cloth, was the key. It was an exact match to the one in the drawing. It was made of brass, heavy and intricate, its star-shaped bit a marvel of craftsmanship. It was a key he had made himself. My hands shook as I took it. This was it, the final piece. I turned to the workbench. It was over 10 feet long and 4 feet wide, a behemoth of oak and iron. According to the schematic, the keyhole was on the underside of the top surface, near the front right leg, completely hidden from view unless you were lying on the floor. I got down on my hands and knees on the dusty concrete. The air was cool down there. I ran my fingers along the rough underside of the thick oak planking until I felt it. A small, recessed brass plate, perfectly flush with the wood. And in its center, a star-shaped keyhole. With my heart pounding in my ears, I inserted the key. It slid in with a smooth, satisfying click. I turned it. I expected a single clunk, like the door lock. But that's not what happened. Instead, a series of soft, whirring clicks echoed from deep within the bench. Gears were turning. Levers were shifting. It was a complex mechanical lock, a puzzle box the size of a small car. I turned the key again, a quarter turn to the right. More clicks. A quarter turn to the left. A deep, resonant thunk echoed from the center of the bench. I scrambled to my feet and looked at the workbench. Nothing had changed. For a terrible second, I thought it had failed. But then I saw it. A thin, almost invisible seam had appeared on the surface, tracing the outline of a large, rectangular section in the middle. I pushed on it gently. It didn't move. I pushed harder. And then, with a soft sigh of displaced air, the entire central section of the workbench, a piece of solid oak 4 inches thick, rose silently upwards on a hidden mechanism. It lifted about an inch and then stopped, waiting. I slid the heavy lid aside. And there it was, the hidden compartment, the heart. It was a deep, lead-lined cavity, about 3 feet long and 2 feet wide. And it was not empty. The first thing I saw was the money. Neat, paper-banded bundles of cash, 50s and 100s. I reached in and lifted one. It was more money than I had ever held in my life. I counted the bundles. There had to be close to $100,000 there. It was a fortune. It was a new life, right there in cash. My grandfather hadn't been broke. He had liquidated his real assets and hidden them, turning them into something untraceable. But beneath the money, there was more. I lifted out the stacks of cash and set them aside. Underneath them was a leather-bound ledger. I opened it. It was Marcus Thorne's secret accounts book. Page after page detailed the fraudulent loans, the kickbacks from Northwood Development, the offshore accounts where he'd funneled the money. My grandfather's precise notes were in the margins, cross-referencing dates, amounts, and conversations. It was a meticulous record of the entire conspiracy. It wasn't just an accusation, it was the evidence. Next to the ledger was a thick, waterproof portfolio. Inside was the original, notarized deed to the property, free and clear, dated from before my grandfather ever met Thorne. It proved his unencumbered ownership, and with it were copies of the fraudulent loan agreements Northwood had used, along with signed affidavits from 2 other local business owners they had squeezed out with similar tactics. He hadn't just been protecting himself, he'd been building a case. And at the very bottom, there was one last letter. Just a single page. "My dearest Alara," it read. "I hope this finds you well. I hope this finds you strong. The money is for you. Use it to build a life, any life you want. Go to college, travel the world, never look back. That is the easy path, and you have earned it. The ledger and the deed, that is for the harder path. It is the truth. The truth is a heavy and dangerous thing. You can use it to find justice, for me and for this town. Or you can bury it and walk away, and no one will ever blame you. The choice is, and has always been, yours. The only thing I ever wanted was for you to be free. Free from them, free from the past, free even from me and my battles. Whatever you choose, know that my love for you was the truest thing in my life. The workshop is yours. What you build in it is up to you." I sank to the floor, the letter clutched in my hand, the evidence of a corporate crime spree on one side of me and a life-altering amount of cash on the other. He had left me everything. The means to escape, the weapons to fight, and the freedom to choose. The weight of that freedom, of that trust, was heavier than any amount of money. I looked around the workshop, at the tools on the walls, at the light streaming through the door, at the unfinished rocking horse. It wasn't just a building, it was an inheritance of strength, of integrity, of love. And in that moment, I knew there was no choice. I knew what I had to build. The days that followed were a blur of focused action. The threat from Jensen and his 1-week deadline had lit a fire under me. I took a small portion of the cash from the compartment and deposited it into a new bank account in town, enough for living expenses and something more. My first call was to a lawyer. Not the indifferent firm that had handled the estate, but a retired, sharp-as-a-tack lawyer Mrs. Gable from the grocery store had recommended, a man named Arthur Vance who had a reputation for hating big corporations, especially Northwood. I met him in his dusty, book-lined office. I laid out the ledger, the deed, and the affidavits on his desk. He spent an hour reading, his expression growing grimmer and more focused with each page. When he was done, he looked up at me over his spectacles, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. "Miss Blackwood," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Your grandfather wasn't just a carpenter, he was a master strategist. This is a nuke. What Northwood did is called corporate racketeering. They won't know what hit them." He took the case. While he began preparing the legal assault, I started my own project. I wasn't just going to save the workshop, I was going to bring it back to life. I used the money to hire a local contractor, a gruff but honest man whose own father had been a friend of Silas's, to repair the sagging roof and replace the broken window. I paid for the supplies in cash at the local hardware store, whose owner gave me a welcome home discount. Word travels fast in a small town. People saw the work being done. They saw me, Silas Blackwood's granddaughter, not running away, but digging in. The initial suspicion from the locals began to melt away, replaced by a quiet, watchful support. Mrs. Gable started dropping off fresh bread and pastries. The hardware store owner let me borrow a power sander. People would stop by, not to be nosy, but to share a memory of my grandfather, to offer a word of encouragement. I was no longer an outsider. I was becoming part of the town's fabric. The workshop itself transformed. With the roof fixed and the windows clean, light filled the space. I spent weeks sanding, staining, and sealing the wooden walls, bringing out their deep, rich color. I meticulously cleaned and oiled every single one of my grandfather's tools, arranging them back on their pegboards not as museum pieces, but as instruments ready for use. I even finished the rocking horse. Sanding it smooth, carving the final details, and giving it 3 coats of varnish was my own private memorial to him. It now stood proudly in a corner, a symbol of a promise fulfilled. The day before Northwood's deadline, Jensen returned. His black sedan crunched to a halt, and he got out, his face a mask of smug confidence. He saw the new roof, the clean windows. "I see you've been busy," he said, a sneer in his voice. "Putting lipstick on a pig? A futile effort. Your week is up. I have the paperwork right here. $10,000. Sign it, and we can all move on." "I have some paperwork for you, too," I said calmly. At that moment, Arthur Vance's car pulled up behind Jensen's, blocking him in. A local sheriff's deputy got out of the passenger side. Mr. Vance, looking formidable in his rumpled suit, walked up and handed Jensen a thick legal envelope. "That's a civil complaint and a notice of intent to sue Northwood Development, you personally, and your associates for fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering," he said cheerfully. "And this," he added, as the deputy handed Jensen another envelope, "is a subpoena for all of your records, issued in conjunction with a state-level investigation. I believe you know these other gentlemen?" He gestured to 2 other cars that had quietly pulled up, containing the business owners who had signed the affidavits, both now represented by Vance. Jensen's face went from smug to pale to a mottled, furious red. He snatched the documents, his hands shaking. He looked at me, his eyes full of venom. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," he hissed. "I think I do," I said, my voice quiet but clear. "You're the people who underestimated Silas Blackwood, and you're the people who are about to lose." He got in his car and sped away, his tires spitting gravel. The legal battle was long and ugly, but with the evidence my grandfather had so carefully collected, the outcome was never really in doubt. Northwood settled out of court for a massive sum, not just to me, but to the other families they had ruined. The scandal led to a federal investigation, and men like Jensen lost their jobs and their reputations. Blackwood Creek was safe. Months have passed. The workshop is my home and my business. I started small, making custom furniture, using the skills my grandfather taught me and the beautiful old wood he left behind. The town, seeing its chance for a real revitalization instead of a corporate takeover, is slowly coming back to life. New families are moving in, drawn by the quiet and the sense of community. My little business is thriving. I am not a millionaire. The settlement money mostly went to legal fees and establishing a trust for the town's restoration. But I am rich in ways that matter. I have a home. I have work that I love. I have a community. My grandfather left me a choice. The easy path or the hard one. The money or the truth. I realized, standing in that dusty workshop, that the real inheritance wasn't the choice between them. It was the strength to take on both. The money gave me the means, but the truth gave me the reason. He didn't just leave me a building or a bank account. He left me a legacy of resilience. He taught me that a home isn't just a place you own, it's a place you are willing to fight for. He taught me that the most valuable things are not the ones we are given, but the ones we build with our own two hands. My story isn't about finding a hidden treasure. It's about uncovering a hidden truth and, in the process, discovering my own strength. It's about a second chance, not just for me, but for a whole town. It's about understanding that sometimes the greatest act of love is not to make someone's path easy, but to give them the tools to clear it themselves. If this story resonated with you, if you believe in the power of fighting for your own place in the world, then please subscribe and become part of this community. These are the stories we tell here. Stories about finding our way through the dark and building our own light. And I want you to tell me in the comments, what have you built from the pieces that were left to you? What does the word inheritance truly mean to you? I read every single comment because I believe our stories are the most powerful tools we have. And together, we can build something that lasts.